So I'd love to welcome Stephen Guerin from Santa Fe. He is with Simtable. It's an invention of his own, and I'm going to let him describe to us exactly how that works. Welcome, Stephen.
Oh, thanks, Teri. The sand table, we call it the sim table, is a way of bringing a community around a physical table filled with sand and sculpt the terrain of their world. So we project down the elevation from GIS data files, geographic information systems. So we color the sand and let them sculpt it. And we put some water on there, simulated water, so they can trace in the contours where the water would be running, and lets the community basically break the ice and form their neighborhood or city or region, and then start to look at ecological issues that are confronting them as a community. So we can project simulations of fire, flood, hazmat, ecological change, traffic evacuations, all that kind of stuff. And we're mainly involved internationally with the issues around wildfire. It's in the news now, and using a table as a way that people can come around and look at the issue together as a community, and not just sit back in their chairs watching a PowerPoint presentation or being talked at with graphs and charts, but actually to have kind of a shared experience, literally touching their land forms and having conversations around it. We often say there's ultimately more intelligence around the table than we're projecting onto it. So it really opens up the creative potential of the community if they kind of let down their guard and try to find creative responses.
A few years ago, I got to be in Santa Fe and I got to see that table, and it's a little bit more than a sand table with an overhead projector, which you might think of from back in school days. Tell us about the computer system, how it gets set above the table so that you do understand the lay of the land in a very real sense.
Sure. So we're taking pretty much off-the-shelf computer projectors that you'll see in a classroom or in an office, and we're coupling that with a camera. So that nice feedback of a projector projecting down onto a table and the camera watching what's being projected, which allows us to basically structure the light and change the light so the offset camera can recover the height. So a off-the-shelf projector and say a phone camera can be turned into a 3D scanner. And then on top of that, we use the camera watching the table to track things like a laser pointer or a lighter when we light the fire. So we're basically turning surfaces in the room to become interactive. And the sand table is a first example of that. So it's really just cameras and projectors interacting. Yeah.
So I've seen you interact with real humans, and there was a piece not too long ago on 60 Minutes about this. I think the fire is called the Campfire. Is that right? the example that you use?
Yes, so that's a very tragic fire where we lost 85 of our citizens. The fire started at 6:30 in the morning. People are getting ready for work and school about 10 miles east of Paradise, California, near Chico. So it was a faulty power line or two that started a spark during the October-November times, which we're in right now, which California traditionally has the Santa Ana winds, which basically the winds come from, they reverse their direction, are very, very warm and dry. They're no longer coming from the ocean, they're coming from the other way. So they're dry and very fast, 50 to 70 miles per hour in dry conditions. So that fire not only spread quickly on the surface, but a lot of embers carried 3, 4, 5 miles ahead and started igniting homes from the embers. And by 8 o'clock, 8:30, it was in the town 10 miles away. And by 11:30, a lot of Paradise was on fire, and ultimately 14,000 houses were lost, or homes were lost, and 85 citizens. So that was one of the things, on that 60 Minutes was a couple days after that when they were filming what actually happened. So the table is used in a kind of a public information outreach way. But later that turns us, we've really focused on how can we improve real-time intel using cameras on citizen phones or from the aircraft in a much better real time, so we can be more coordinated as a community.
Insurance companies are pushing back with government agencies about underwriting homes and businesses that are in those pathways. So right now, when you look at disasters, natural disasters, they seem to range from the wine country to the Louisiana bayou. Can your mapping system tell us, and is it even ethical, of where we should be building and where we should be farming? Can the system work that way as well?
Yeah, so let's see. The first thing I would say is all models are wrong. Some are useful. So we definitely recognize the limit of prediction. It certainly can help make more informed decisions, but I think in two ways. One is educating the community about the risk, and so that they can be collectively have collective action in mitigating it. So so for instance, like the fuels buildup in California, trying to kind of let people understand the need to do fuels mitigation. So things like prescribed burning to reduce the fuel load, or fuels treatments, and also improving their houses to withstand the ember shower. You know, a lot of people think it's this big direct wall of flame coming through town, when in fact it's the little embers for the most part that get in the eaves and come into underneath your deck where the pine needles are, that ignite the home. It's not this big wall of flame. I mean, many of those houses that you look at burned down, around their houses are still trees with dead leaves on them. So you know it wasn't this big flame coming through. So there's insurance companies have a big role to play in giving incentive on how to build your homes and be ready for the embers. You know, that said, you know, I think moving into the wildland urban interface is what we call it, is a big challenge. You know, Mexico is in the same climate as, say, California, but doesn't have the big incidents of fires because they're not suppressing all their fires, right? We've had 70 years, 80 years of tradition of stopping every fire instead of letting some of them burn. So it is a complex issue. I think the table and modeling helps open that discussion, right? And how to actually live with fire.
In terms of fires currently that we've seen a lot of conversations around, our president thinks that if we kind of cleaned up the forest floor, we wouldn't have this issue. Native American tribes have said, give us back the land. We know how to manage these forests and these wild places. Where do you fall in that?
Yeah, so I think in the third one you'll hear is the climate change, right? So these are the major factors, and they're all right. It's a complex issue. You know, cleaning up the forest floor with rakes, that might be a misstatement. So we don't need rakes, but it's not too far off to say that understory that's below the canopy, it's a rat's nest. You know, it's very dense, and if you had regular return of fire, that stuff would not be at that kind of density. You mentioned the native knowledge of, and I'll point out someone like a Bill Tripp of Karuk tribe in Northern California, as well as in Australia. A lot of long-time wisdom and tradition of burning, often tied to cultural activities and religious ceremony. There's something very deep about fire, and in our suppression of fire, I find it very interesting, and I'll just allow me go into a little bit of a theory. You know, if you think about fire as being oxygen combining with the sugar or glucose, which is a tree, and a carbohydrate, if you will, and chemically a C6H12O6. So oxygen and that carbohydrate become H2O and carbon dioxide. You know, that white smoke you see, if it's burning, complete burning, it's white smoke. That's water. We can't see carbon dioxide. So the only two products are water and carbon dioxide in a simplified model. So that's really a geyser of water coming out of the forest, right? And very much our breath is the same. We are fire. In our mitochondria, we're doing combustion and respiration, converting a carbohydrate with oxygen as we breathe in to carbon dioxide and water. We're very much like the forest. And coming the other way is carbon dioxide and water becoming the tree, the carbohydrate, and putting out oxygen. Well, that's photosynthesis, right? So fire and photosynthesis, light and heat, having a dance. right? Fire is not something external coming in like a monster is destroying the forest. It's the very nature of breathing out, right? And, and that's a very important dynamic, and we can't just squash that. That's like squashing your respiration, clogging up your tailpipe. We need that process. Now, when we have the densities we do, we have intense fires that scorch the earth. But if we can get back to a natural occurrence, much more low intensity, and nature will then tend to tune itself to this chaotic fractal regime that's in a very tight area that nature, left to its own, tends to tune itself, where you have massive biodiversity and a very healthy forest. But right now we're way over here. Now, climate change is definitely a factor. We have the droughts and just exacerbating this. But it takes a paradigm shift of what is fire and how do we live with it, and how do we even think about ourselves as embedded in this whole process. It is a change of nature, and we look at even what is a living system. In the 90s, we have this Darwinian opinion of evolution through reproductive success and DNA. We're starting to move with my colleagues at Santa Fe Institute in Los Alamos and others around the world. Life is something that's much more of a distributed, decentralized property of the system. It's not a property of the individual, which is a Darwinian kind of mindset, and brings up competition for a niche. We're much more embedded in this channel that's a back and forth between, like, say, combustion and photosynthesis. Just like our mitochondria is interacting with a chloroplast. The chloroplast is doing the photosynthesis. And that channel between that action is what life is. We think, and it's not just something that's a property of the individual. So this ecological approach and perspective is a very important transition, I think, as we're going through the next 20 years, both in science, but also how we organize resources in our world, post-COVID.
So this kind of dovetails into the complex interdisciplinary systems that you work with.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about that, and what the Simtable and what you personally do to work with other groups.
The Simtable is a means of interaction to bring people together. On top of that, we apply the science of complexity and some of the tools, and in particular what's called agent-based modeling, where we simulate systems and the theories around how systems self-organize. Instead of top-down command and control, telling everything what to do. Starting in the 80s, there was and starting in Los Alamos and Sandia and other places, this looking at, even in physics, systems that when they get far from equilibrium, maybe it's a temperature or pressure gradient or energy gradient of some type, that it will generate structures like a tornado or a vortex that is able to move that system back to equilibrium. Well, that's not just a physics idea. It's also in biology. If you look at how ants find food, in a distributed way, they're able to learn where the food is through local interactions without having someone in control, and solving the problem of the least action path or least effort path to find that food. But you see it in social systems at much macro scales. You see it in chemistry. All the disciplines we can find ideas of self-organization. And it's not completely new, but it certainly the last 30 years. And how we design our systems, how do we engineer systems, these soft assembled systems from the bottom up that are able to organize? Well, that kind of engineering, we're getting more formal. Before it was a lot of feeling around in the dark and trying things out, but there's starting to be engineering practices and on how to design these systems. So that would be what I would characterize as the science of complexity. Yeah.
So based on your work, using your Simtable, using what you know, is there hope for the future?
Yes, and I mean I'm optimistic. Anytime you're going through a phase transition, though, it can go either way. We are certainly at a phase transition. The shutting down of air travel, the rethinking of our role in an economy, of policing, of gender, of what is life, abortion. We're confronting so many different questions in the world, and how do we organize ourselves, right? And healthcare and the role of an employee and a firm. I'm optimistic that we're going to better forms. It's uncertain when you go, it's very chaotic and uncertain. I mean, the definition of a chaos is it's sensitive to initial conditions. And in a phase transition, that's where you have chaos. On either side of the phase transition, it's very stable and predictable. But in this phase transition area, it's very hard to predict where we're going to go. But I find it healthy that we're going through it, right? It can be scary and uncertain and fear. But like fire, most of our issues are fear. Just like with, if you don't know where the fire is, it's fearful. But if you know where it is, you can understand it and react appropriately, right? The more we can have dialogue and I think visualization and modeling not for prediction, but just at least to communicate someone's worldview with somebody else. A paradigm and worldview are almost synonyms, right? So a model is a way that I can express my worldview, you can express your worldview, and we can have dialogue. The table ultimately, we think, is more about communication than it is about prediction. In the same way that our computers in the 80s was about computation and getting an answer. But by the 90s and now, it's as much or more about, it's a communication tool.
Right.
We're not computing as much as we're communicating. And I think modeling and visualization and the table is about that. How do we communicate and find solutions?